Hi, I'm Heiga, your host for A Writer's Life, a place where I'll be in conversation with fellow authors. We'll discuss all things writing. They'll read from their latest work, and we'll go and explore what happens beyond the pen in a writer's life. It's going to be a page turner. I just know it. Pull up a chair and join us. Today, I have with me Betty Keller, who is an author, playwright, historian, editor, and a mentor. She has helped launch many writers' careers, including mine. Betty is the original founding member of the Festival of the Written Arts in Sechelt. Betty has written 17 books and served as one of BC's most prolific book editors. She has won many awards, including this year's George Woodcock Lifetime Achievement Award for an outstanding literary career in British Columbia. And I'm incredibly honored to have Betty on The Writer's Life. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you.
I'm going to launch right into a question, and this is a question I ask all my guests. Where did you grow up, and what was it like around the dinner table when you were a child?
Well, I was born in Vancouver and we lived in Burnaby until I was about 8 or 9, and then moved out to Langley to a farm there. I was the fourth of 5 daughters in the family. There were 7 of us, of course, around the dinner table. Mother organized when we would speak and when we wouldn't speak. Our dinner table conversations centered on what the adults had been doing, and if there was time for us to discuss things, we were allowed. Mother had been a school teacher, you see. I think she regarded us as just more students.
My mom wasn't a teacher. She was a stay-home mom. But when we would be coming home from school and we had to do our schoolwork, my mom was a trained chef and she was always cooking in the kitchen, and she always had a sharp kitchen knife. When we needed help with our homework, she'd always use the knife to point at the questions. And for me, I was always really terrified that she'd chop my fingers, so I could never focus on anything that she was trying to tell us or teach us. And so I didn't want to have my fingers cut off. So consequently, I wasn't the greatest student. So what a difference, right?
Yes. No, we were, it was a book-filled house, but it was a matter of Mother had to check your hands to see that they were clean before you sat down with the book. And I always wanted to curl up with books, but that wasn't done. You had the book on the dining table, and that's where you read it. Kind of well-organized family.
Your mom must have treasured books. Like it sounds like she would have a lot of respect for books.
Yeah.
And did that kind of transfer to you as well?
I read anything that was in print. In those days, the Saturday newspaper came with a special section that was all short stories and that kind of thing. And the Family Herald always came out. I think it was called the Family Herald. Anyhow, it had a novel in it. They were really junky novels. But as I read anything with words on the page, I read them all. Mother said we weren't to read them, but I hid it underneath my pillow and read it after lights out.
I can imagine you with a flashlight under the covers. I love that. I personally didn't grow up with any storybooks. Well, I had 2 and that was about it. And I didn't have a flashlight. So I just used my imagination and always listened to people telling stories. Did you grow up with a lot of stories being told in your house?
No, stories weren't told. We got our stories from books. It wasn't a storytelling household because it was brought up very much on British lines. It was quite a proper household in spite of us being on a farm. And when I was in grade 11, the farm was sold and father went back to the kinds of jobs that he'd had before, this time as a hospital administrator. Life changed enormously at that point, though we were still living in Langley.
When you guys read books, so probably a lot of the children, your siblings, including your mom, would have read the same books. Would you guys have discussions afterwards about the book?
No, there were never any discussions of books. And a lot of the books I read had belonged to my older sisters. They were just sort of handed down from one to the next in the family. I told stories to my younger sister. I think she never quite forgave me for those because they were bedtime stories for her, and they always had ogres and monsters and that kind of thing. And long after I'd fallen asleep, she was lying there worrying about the ogres under her bed, you know. But and I think I was about 8 or 9 when I figured out that I was going to be a writer. That's where I was going.
That was my next question. When did you know? So at 8 or 9, what was that turning point? Do you remember that moment?
No, I don't think it was a moment. I think it was just that growing knowledge that that's what I had to do.
That's wonderful. I love that. What was your first writing job then?
That's hard to say. I didn't have a first writing job because my attempts to become a writer who got paid for writing didn't pan out. I I got a job at the Vancouver Sun, but there was no room in editorial for me at the time. Went to work in classified, and maybe that's my first writing job, was writing classified ads for people. I didn't remain there long. The Sun was having a bad year and they fired about 100 of us just before Christmas. And I went to work for an insurance company after that, settling health insurance claims. It was a long time before I got a job that somebody actually paid me for writing.
What was the first piece that you ever had published?
Oh, there was a series on the CBC called John Draney Presents. If I remember correctly, it was at noontime it came on. It was every day of the week, so it was in constant need of new stories. And I sold quite a few short stories to him. They were half-hour long programs, I think. So these were very short stories. It gave me good practice.
Do you have any of those stories still?
No,
No.
I can only remember vaguely the name of one of them was Mr. Tooley's Zoo, but I can't even remember what it was about.
I wonder if they still have that, your stories logged.
They didn't do that in those days.
What year are we talking?
This point would have been the mid 1950s. This is a long time ago when they didn't record those things to keep for posterity.
I know I grew up with a bit of Lights Out, it was called, and listened to them at night in bed.
Mhm.
And I guess that was probably that you did, obviously, with your sister. You created Lights Out, maybe.
Yes.
Because I would lay there at night awake, freaked out from listening to these scary things.
Well, I did my best to freak her out. Poor girl.
I love it. What was your first published work and who was the publisher?
Oh, my first published book was a book of short plays I wrote for my students. I was by that time teaching high school English and drama. And during a summer school at UBC, I wrote a number of very short plays to be used for exercises in the classroom. They were 5 and 10-minute long plays. At the end of the term, the instructor, George McWhirter, said, you should get these published. And I said, oh, yeah, sure. And he said, and I know a publisher who would like to do it. And I said, yeah, sure. And 2 weeks later, I had a contract with Sherry Smith, who was the publisher of November House, a small Vancouver publishing company. But that book went on to be used as a textbook for high school drama courses. for quite a number of years after that. So that was my first book. And, you think of the first book for most people, they send it off to 42 publishers before somebody accepts it. So I just thought, hey, this is how it's done. You just finish a book and somebody comes along and says, yeah, I'll publish that. Well, no.
Yeah, I know when I sent my book out between agents, short stories like lit mags and publishing houses, I sent out over 141 until finally my book was published. I thought like you, oh, the first one is going to want it. They didn't.
Yeah, well, it doesn't exactly work that way.
It doesn't. No.
So,
Wish it did, but it doesn't.
yeah.
So I also know that you created the Sunshine Coast Festival of the Written Arts. You're the original founding member. What inspired you to do that?
Oh, I was teaching writing courses here, as I always have. And I had moved to the Sunshine Coast in 1980. And within a couple of years, I was busy having groups, much as the critiquing groups I organize now. And I realized that the only person that most of them ever talked to who had actually published a book was myself. And they needed to hear from more writers. They needed to understand what the writing life was really like. So we had a meeting at the Arts Center and put a notice in the paper saying, anybody who writes, please come out for this event. And 35 people came out for that event. There were all these people on the Sunshine Coast who were writing and who had not had contact with other writers. So we decided we would hold a weekend and invite a number of real writers to talk about their writing. And then I said, well, there's a problem. We're going to have to pay those people at least an honorarium and provide them with transportation to get here and place to stay overnight if they wanted to stay. So I said, there's a problem. 35 of us here can't come up with all that money. So what if we do this and throw it open to the public? So it's a readers and writers event. And before we broke up that day, that had been decided. We had a date set. We had decided where it would all take place. We had decided some of the writers we would invite because everybody had suggestions of great BC writers that they wanted to hear from. And we even had a name for the event. Bruce Wordsworth came up with Festival of the Written Arts because we wanted to hear from not just writers of novels, not just writers of nonfiction. We wanted to hear from poets and playwrights, anybody who wrote.
And including musicians, songwriters?
No, we weren't as interested in songwriters at that point. We did later on realize that was another area to examine, but that wasn't suggested right at the beginning. That was April the 13th, 1983, and we held the first festival the first weekend in August of that year. So we had a lot of organizing to do, but we had a lot of people interested in doing that organizing. There we were, and away we went.
Where was the first event held? I mean, the pavilion where it is now is absolutely beautiful. And I'm sure it wasn't there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
First event was all the events of the first festival were supposed to take place in the Arts Center. But halfway through the actual weekend, they told us, oh, we've double booked. You can't have it on Saturday night. And as that was the most important event of the weekend, we suddenly had to scramble for another place. And we went to Green Court Hall at that point was available, fortunately. And after that, we held all the events at Green Court. Once we were too big to fit into the Green Court Hall, we put up tents in the parking lot. Then one day, two of the fellows who got tired of putting the tents up each year said, we figured out where we can build a pavilion of our own. Come and see where it is. And they had figured out that they could fit it onto the Rockwood grounds. And that pavilion was built by the festival with volunteer labor. It was all headed up by Dave Foss, who is no longer with us, unfortunately.
Mhm.
But Dave had just retired from the RCMP and had other things to do with his time, but he headed up the building of the pavilion. Other volunteers just gathered. In very short order, we had about 200 volunteers who were doing something or other for the festival. And it was all volunteers. It was marvelous.
It's absolutely incredible. You had such a wonderful vision of creating something so magical. And I have to say, it's one of my favorite times of the year, August, because of the Writers' Festival. So thank you for that. You were my mentor, and I can't imagine having done all of this on my own. There would be no way I would be published now. And what an amazing gift you have given me. Did you have a particular mentor in your life, in your early writing career?
I had a number of mentors along the way. And to all of them, I'm enormously grateful because I accepted their mentoring as if, I had a God given right to it. They spent their time moving me along in my writing career. There's half a dozen of them, really. Some of them, it was for a brief time. Some of them, it was for longer. When I worked at the Vancouver Sun, it was Doris Milligan there who was my mentor and who was trying to get me into the editorial department. Didn't work out at the time because at that time I thought of myself as having a career as a journalist. So she was trying to ease me along that way because I had done, they give you a whole barrage of tests before you come in, before they hire you, to find out if you're good editorial material. And I was, but there wasn't a job for me at the time. And later I took a course in writing for television. And this was early television where it was quite constrained about what you could write because they didn't record them. It was done live. Ray Whitehouse, who was the head of television drama for Western Canada, was the instructor. And he was very good in moving me along there, especially in understanding dialogue, because I was writing stilted dialogue and he showed me what was wrong with that. And away we went. And people like George McWhirter, when I took the summer course with him, he was there to push me along. So there'd been all of those people in my career. You just naturally help other younger writers along as you come.
I mean, that's really nice. It's like passing the torch on, pulling
Yeah.
people into it. It is really nice to share knowledge and not keep it for yourself. Especially, I think, for Canadian writers. I'm not sure, how much are we on the world stage as Canadian writers?
Oh, I think we've become a lot bigger on the world stage. When you have someone like Alice Munro getting the Nobel Prize for Literature, and you have writers like Margaret Atwood, this is a writer who's known in all the English-speaking world. I don't think we're as small a writing group as that. I think that Canada has a larger share of well-known writers in the world, in the English-speaking world, than our size would suggest we should have.
Right. So we're kind of claiming our space.
Yes, yeah,
I know you're a substantive editor. Can
yes.
you talk a little bit about the different types of editors, what their roles are, and maybe talk a little bit about the inside of the publishing world?
Well, we write to communicate. It doesn't matter even if you're writing a diary or keeping a journal, you're still writing to communicate because you're writing that for the yourself of the future. So you go back to read those alone time later, learn more about what was I thinking back then. So even that kind of writing is done to communicate. And human beings, of course, we invented the language in order to communicate. And then we invented symbols so that that language didn't have to just be spoken. We could see it written down so that I could see what somebody was thinking 100 years before because they put it down in those funny little symbols. And we've learned to read those symbols. So the communicating part is the biggest part of writing. When we write, we need to be always analyzing what we've written in order to decide, is what I have written, is that going to communicate to other people? Have I told it in a linear fashion, a beginning, a middle, and an end, so that somebody else is going to understand it? So here we're talking about story, of course. Story. It doesn't matter whether it's fiction or nonfiction. We're talking about story. And story only makes sense to somebody else if it's structured right. The writer needs to be forever analyzing. Is what I have written constructed so that it communicates to somebody else? But we're not always good at that. We get too close to our writing. And that's where an editor comes in. So there's two kinds of editors. There's copy editors and there's substantive editors. People can't figure out that copy editor bit sometimes because they don't understand where that word copy came from. And it's because in publishing newspapers, journals, books, we refer to the work, the finished text, as a copy. So a copy editor finishes the book, does the finished version of the book, corrects the grammatical errors, corrects the punctuation, makes it ready to be published. A substantive editor comes before that in the process. Substantive editor is looking for the substantial things that need to be corrected in a manuscript, the big stuff that hasn't quite worked. So the first substantive editor I ever met and worked with was a lady known as Marilyn Sachs, and she was the managing editor of Douglas and McIntyre in those days. And I had just finished writing my biography.
What year was this?
This was 1982, well, 1981 at this point. I had just finished writing my biography of Pauline Johnson, the Mohawk poet. And naturally, I thought it was perfect. It was my fourth book, so I knew everything at that point. And she would do something for me. She edited that book, and she would look at a sentence and she'd say, "What do you mean by this sentence?" And she would read it out. And I would sit there and tell her, "Well, this is what I meant by it." And she would say, "So why didn't you write that?" And
I love that.
always very sweetly done. And finally, I got it. It didn't have to be fancy words. It didn't have to be a fancy structure. Clearest, plainest words work best, and the plainest structures work best if I was going to communicate to other people. And I started learning.
It's interesting you say that because I remember a time when I was with you and we were going through my work, and you had come to a piece that I had written, and you said, "Why are you using all these fancy words?" And I remember saying to you, "Because I want to sound smart." And you said, "Well, stop that. Just use plain words." And that has always stuck with me. Did you go to school for editing?
No, I never went and took courses on editing. You can do that now, thankfully, and learn a lot faster. I had to do mine by trial and error, but it was a matter of learning how to communicate, analyzing. Have I told that story in a linear fashion? And if not, why not? Because sometimes it's right to tell the end of the story first, because the story that is going to unfold is better told that way, and it works that way. But most often, telling the story in a linear fashion so that the reader gets what happened first and what happened next and what happened after that, and we build to a climax and tidy it up with a denouement at the end. Mostly that works.
Mhm.
Not always, but mostly it works. So that's the difference between a substantive editor and a copy editor. A good writer doesn't need that much substantive editing, but even the best writer sometimes needs help.
Mhm.
It's a business of learning how to analyze your own work so that you see the structure beneath the story.
Yeah.
Those are the two, of course, the two big things in writing. The story's no good if it is unstructured. The structure's no good if it doesn't have a story in it.
I just like to say this. For me, I realize that the writing really starts in the editing process. And there's this myth that's perpetuated by TV where they portray a writer who's on holidays, either in France or in Italy, and they write their manuscript in a relatively short time. But in fact, it actually takes quite some time to write your first draft. But in film, they make it seem like you write the story and it's done. Pretty much, they never show the editing process, how hard that actually is for some writers, and how much work goes into it. As you would always say to me, the writing starts when you start editing, or that's when the real work happens.
Well, you used a word there that's very important. You talked about first draft.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of writers, many writers, think in terms of, well, I've written it from beginning to end. It's now ready. That's your first draft. And how many drafts are you going to need? As many as it takes to get the story to work. And it's often been said your first book is going to take you 10 years. They take you a little less each time.
Right.
And yeah, yes and no. It wasn't my first book that took me that long. It was that book on Pauline Johnson that took me a lot longer because of all the research that was needed for it.
That takes me to my next question, actually. When you did the research for Pauline Johnson, what was that like? Because nowadays we have the internet and it's so easy just with Google or YouTube to obtain research and information. So, what was that like for you then?
I spent a lot of time in libraries, especially UBC's library, because it's a great one and I know my way around it, having taken my education there and spent a lot of my life while I was a student in the library. But I found the best source for me in those days because I was dealing with a Canadian story at a time when newspapers were big. I read newspapers to get her life because in those days, when she was writing and performing in public, that was the days of great newspapers. And there were newspapers right across the country. And the important part was that big university libraries kept copies day by day of every one of those newspapers across the country. In following Pauline Johnson's life, because she was a performer as well as a writer, the arts column in the newspapers would say that she had performed at such and such a place and that she had this kind of audience or what have you. And then it would say she will be performing tomorrow in, and they would name the town. So I dig out the newspaper for that town and go through it until I found how had she done in her performance there? And that would tell me the next town she was going to. So I was able to follow her career back and forth across the country. There were gaps, of course, and I'd be wondering, where did she go? Where did she go? And sometimes it was because she went home to Brantford for a rest or to visit with family, or she was busy writing a book or a book of poems. And that's how research was done.
Did you ever interview any of her relatives about her?
No, neither she nor her brothers or sister married, so there were no descendants. And she died in 1913, February 1913. And her sister lived the longest, and I think she lived another 15, 20 years after that. There was nobody to interview for that part of her life, But there was a lot of material that was available there, and several museums and archives across the country had copies of her letters. Her sister burned most of her letters because she didn't want the world to know her sister's private life.
Wow.
So a lot was missing there.
Hmm. Yeah, what a shame. What inspired you to write that book?
My first publisher,
Ah,
she had received a manuscript from somebody who had written a fictional story of Pauline Johnson's life. And she said, I can't publish this because it's just fiction. She said, why don't you write her story? And she said, what do you know about her? I think actually she began the conversation by saying, what do you know about Pauline Johnson? I said, well, she was a person from Vancouver, and she's buried in Stanley Park, and she wrote the song My Paddle Sings. And she said, well, you've got two of those right, but no, she's not from the West Coast. She was Mohawk. I said, oh, my mistake. And the reason I knew that much about her is because she was one of my mother's favorite poets. And my mother would quote from her poems. Back to mother again, eh?
yeah, at the
So,
table.
but the important part was that as soon as I got started on trying to find out about her life, I became fascinated by it. One thing leads to another in this writing business.
So it does, because I know for all the research I did on my novel, one of the books that I read for the research inspired my second novel. So
Yes.
it's so true. Sometimes you think, oh my God, what am I going to write about next? And I know now for me is I don't worry about that, because I do know that and trust that something is going to inspire the next piece of work. Do you find that with the writing that you've done?
Yes. Every one of them has come out of something I discovered while I was working on the one before.
Nice. Is there one of your books that you wrote that's your favorite? Do you have a favorite?
Whatever I'm working on at the time.
I love it. That's so good. And I know that you are also a ghostwriter, or I'm not sure if you still do ghostwriting now.
No.
Oh, you don't? Can you talk a little bit about that process and what sort of person hires a ghostwriter?
Sometimes ghostwriting job starts with a publisher who wants a book about a certain person's life, and that person is not a writer. So sometimes the impetus for doing it comes from the publisher rather than a writer.
Mm,
And there are always contracts that are difficult because you're digging inside someone's life who's not altogether sure that that part of their life should be public.
right.
So it's a somewhat fraught relationship. And there's always the privacy angle, because when I do one of those, I don't want it acknowledged. And that's usually fine.
Some of my writing friends, they want to write their memoirs, but they're really afraid to get to sort of the deep personal issues that they're not comfortable putting out on pages. How do you inspire or get somebody to do that? Is there a way or
No, that book can't be written.
right?
So, and remember, memoirs are not biography. Memoirs are a a chunk of a life rather than a biography, which is an entire life.
That
And biographies are almost always written when that life is over. But memoirs are if you've taken part in some event that was a world-shattering event, you want to talk about that because of the effect it had on you. Say if you were involved in 9/11
right.
and had been involved in that, that book would be worth writing simply because it would be that event from a fresh angle.
Right. So a memoir is just a section of your life, and a biography is your whole life. And what you had said is a biography is usually written after the person
Has left us. Yeah.
yeah,
And an autobiography is you writing your own life from your point of view. But a memoir, notice that the word memoir is almost always has an S on the end of it because it's talking about episodes within one's life.
Well, that's interesting. One more question. You have edited hundreds of books, I'm sure of that. What advice can you give to a writer when it comes to having their work edited? Because I know, having taken classes and courses and being in writing groups, that sometimes the writer has a really hard time with receiving critique. Can you just talk a little bit about that process for a
Well,
writer?
first of all, you better not have a hard time being critiqued because once your book is out in the world, it's going to be critiqued by everybody who reads it or decides not to read it. So a writer has to have a fairly thick skin to begin with. I would recommend to writers that they don't head first for an editor, but they head for a critiquing group of their peers, other writers who are willing to give them advice or criticism on their work. But if that's not possible and you're looking for an editor, you better have a very thick skin because that editor is going to try to help you to make that manuscript better than it was. I always cite the case of the greatest editor that I know of, whose name was Maxwell Perkins. And he was the editor for guys like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe, none of whom were easy to deal with, all of whom didn't like being edited whatsoever because they thought what they'd written was perfect to begin with. But he is the reason that they got published, really, because he worked with them calmly and didn't lose his cool when they lost theirs. But I think that the fact that he made those writers greater than they would have been without him, and the whole of literature would be had a loss if he hadn't been there. I think that says what editing is about. It's someone who can stand back and look at your work from another angle, from a distance, and without getting emotionally involved in it, and help you make it better than it would have been. That's the whole goal behind the job. The book is as good as the editor plus the writer. Yeah, it's those two respecting one another and finding ways to make something that was good great.
Betty, it was a delight having you, and thank you for sharing your story and all your knowledge. It was a delight, and I learned even more from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
find more information on Betty Keller, check the link below where I've listed her website. Thanks for joining A Writer's Life. Till next time.